Today's production is presented by Lion Strategy Group, strengthening human resources in every agency we touch by providing valuable, long-lasting tools that foster a healthy work environment, wellness, psychological safety, leadership, and establishing a sustainable trajectory for success. Now, meet today's panelists. Commander Michael Nella, Aurora, Illinois Police Department, retired, now manager for Blue Courage. Chief Danny Barton, City of Coppell, Texas Police Department. Assistant Commissioner Booker Hodges, Department of Public Safety, State of Minnesota. Chief Louis Deckmar, LaGrange, Georgia Police Department. And Minister J.K. Hamilton, DPD, Dallas Chaplain Mountain View Church of Christ, Dallas, Texas. With today's moderator, Erlina Edwards, President of the Arizona Enneagram Association.
What we find in life is all types of events brings us to a moment. And so through faith, we have all come to this moment today to talk about a very, very important topic, and a topic that is becoming more and more visible every day. Today we are hosted by Lions Strategy and sponsored by the Workforce Behavior Intervention Program, which is bringing software for early warning of micro behavior issues with staff or within the organization in an effort to prevent macro issues that are coming about. And today, we are realizing the importance of emotional intelligence more than anything. And when you think about it, we've invested in a lot of things in our country, but mental health and emotional intelligence, we need to be putting that a bit on the front burner. And one of the things that we will be doing today in the conversation is clearing these pathways to be able to have critical conversation when it comes to reimagining the police. Our primary intended outcome today is to build awareness on the importance of this particular topic, and also to engage in activities that are going to be bringing about healing for humankind, and particularly in our own communities. As I said, life brings us to moments through the choices that we make. And you have been called into this circle this morning, not only to hear the words of 5 panelists who are demonstrating internally their heart's desire to bring healing and continued perfection to policing, but to also act as allies and people who will be bringing forth the message that this is a very critical time. One of our esteemed panelists today is Minister J.K. Hamilton, and I will be introducing him shortly. But Minister Hamilton, I'm wondering if I can ask you to take a moment to open us up in prayer.
Absolutely, absolutely. God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this moment, and we thank you for this time. We thank you for the Zoom. We thank you for the efforts being put forth to reshape perceptions and to bring fruit out of fertilizer and to navigate through these unprecedented times. I ask that everyone on here will receive a special blessing according to your will. Thank you, God, in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. So it is. All right, at this time, what I want to do is I'm going to take a few moments to read the bios of our esteemed panelists so that you can see who are with us today. I'm going to be reading eyes down. I don't have a teleprompter, and also I will be reading their profiles in alphabetical order according to last name. So on that note, we will start with Chief Danny Barton, and he began his law enforcement career in 1991 and now serves as Chief of Police in Coppell Police Department in Texas. He served in a criminal investigations unit as a detective until he was promoted to the rank of corporal, remained in investigations until 2012 when he was promoted to sergeant, and then moved into a patrol division as a sergeant in 2015, promoted to the rank of captain. He oversaw patrol operations as well as traffic, K-9 units, and he was promoted to the position of deputy chief in 2018, subsequently now the chief. Danny has a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from the University of Texas at Arlington, and he holds the Master Peace Officer certification. Has attended the School of Police Supervision at the Institute of Law Enforcement Administration. Our next presenter is Chief Louis Deckmar. He has a 41-year law enforcement career, which includes 10 years as a Wyoming police officer and investigator, 1 years in Georgia as a police officer, a detective, a division commander before assuming the position of chief of police in the city of LaGrange, Georgia in 1995. A graduate of the FBI National Academy and the FBI Law Enforcement Executive Seminar, Chief Deckmar is a member of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, a board member of the National Association of Black Members, and an accreditation of the law enforcement agencies. Past president of the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police. Additionally, he is a former council member of the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council and past member of the Georgia Board of Public Safety. He also serves as a federal monitor to the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. He is an adjunct professor of several colleges and institutions. Chief Deckmar is an international presenter for police leaders and elected officials on a wide range of topics, including leadership, ethics, law enforcement management, liability issues, and has provided over 300 training programs to police chiefs, elected officials, and other law enforcement personnel in over 20 states and several countries. He holds a BS in Administration of Justice from the University of Wyoming and has a master's in public administration from Georgia College. He is married to Carmen and they have 2 children, Chris and Kathy. Welcome. And we have that lovely opening in prayer to kind of get us on our day today from Minister J.K. Hamilton. He was originally a New York native. He presently is the minister of the Mountain View Church in Oak Cliffs, which is outside the area of Dallas. His ministry has been with Mountain View Church family since March of 2000. He and his wife Carol have 3 grown children. Minister Hamilton holds an undergraduate degree from Southwestern Christian College and a master's degree in professional development and counseling, and is currently embarking on his PhD. Minister Hamilton is devoted to the training and mentoring of aspiring men who want to go into the ministry, and he has also authored and co-authored various books and has written in many publications, periodicals, and blogs over the year. Minister Hamilton is also a police chaplain and serves the community wholeheartedly in that function. Thank you. Our next panelist today is Assistant Commissioner Booker Hodges from the Department of Public Safety in the state of Minnesota. His experience includes time with the Minnesota State Fair Police, the Dakota and Ramsey County offices. He is formerly a police chief in the city of Prior Lake. He has a wide of experiences working as a school resource officer, a deputy patrol officer, a narcotics detective, SWAT, officer, patrol overnight watch commander, an inspector, an under chief, and an acting chief deputy. Assistant Commissioner Hodges spent 5 years as the president of the Minneapolis NAACP, becoming the first police officer to serve as a branch president. He is active in the community, serving on several nonprofit boards as a director. He is also the president of the Minnesota chapter of the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Executives. He is an adjunct professor at the University of Northwestern in St. Paul. He also has a doctorate in public administration from Hamline University. He has a master's degree from St. Mary's University and a bachelor's degree from Florida Southern College. Assistant Commissioner Hodges is a Minnesota native, and he and his wife have 2 sons. He enjoys teaching, mentoring, and mediating very complex issues, oh, we're glad you're here today, between individuals and associations. And in our final panelists, and as I said, I'm reading these from an alphabetical order, but you know, Michael Neela, you know, he has honed his leadership for many, many years. In fact, Mike Alexander pointed it out today in terms of, you know, being with him for some time. He served our nation in the policing profession before retiring as a police commander in Aurora, Illinois Police Department. As a police officer, he served in many capacities and led the department in re-engineering from a traditional police agency to community policing department. His vast experience has made him a trainer of choice for police agencies and communities nationwide. He is a valued, sought-after speaker, and he is trained in multiple certifications and has been the chief training officer in working with the U.S. Department of Justice, the Chicago Police Department, the Los Angeles Police Department, the New York City Police Department, the United Nations, as well as military and governmental agencies, and also in Fortune 500. He is currently one of the managing partners for Blue Courage, which is an organization that is committed to the design and the delivery of world-class organizational development solutions that unleash the potential of humankind. Michael is certified in delivering Franklin Covey. He is also a master teacher for HeartMath, and if you're familiar with HeartMath, you know that they're leading in emotional intelligence. He travels extensively. He is also a leader in the training of how to start with why. He is in 2016 the recipient of the Attorney General's Award for Meritorious Public Service and the HeartMath Institute Humanitarian Heart Award in recognition for improving the health and well-being of policing through resilience training. So please join me in welcoming our 5 panelists that are here with us today. I want to take a moment to read a statement that was written by Mike Alexander. So we have 2 gentlemen here today from Lion Strategy, Mike Alexander and Mike Wilson. You'll be hearing from them a little later. I want to read a very powerful statement that was written by Mike Alexander to his comrades and his officers. You each carry the banner of integrity and humility. What do followers desire most from you as their leader? Integrity. It's not your character, but their respect for your character. It's not your competence, but it is their confidence in your competence. It's not your interpersonal skills, but it is the rapport that you have with them. They do not care how much you know until you show them how much you care. As you continue to carry the banner of nobility, remember the words of President Theodore Roosevelt, as he called it in the Mackay Mandate: do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. In the 8th century, the prophet's word, Roosevelt heard God's call in his life and in this life to this nation. For Roosevelt, the individual soul and the country heart both needed a sense of justice that is stirred by mercy, and by mercy that is strengthening the commitment to justice. Moreover, Roosevelt knew that neither individual nor country is the center of the universe, nor the seat of wisdom. that belongs to God. God is. And we are each called by God in this lifetime to be able to bring forth our wisdom. Before we begin our conversation with our panelists, let me show you this example.
I deal with African American citizens who are suspicious, untrusting, apprehensive about what the police do and say. And in each of those encounters, I have to build individual trust because in some quarters of our city, African Americans are unwilling to trust the police because of their history. Regretfully, the role of law enforcement agencies throughout this nation in the thousands of lynchings that occurred between 1870 and 1960 is deeply checkered. As one that is proud to be a police professional, I believe this period was our darkest hour. As the LaGrange police chief, I sincerely regret and denounce the role our police department played in Austin's lynching, both through our action and our inaction. And for that, I'm profoundly sorry. It should never have happened. I know the women and men of the LaGrange Police Department, those here today and those that are not, condemn this lynching and join in my apology to the family. I also owe an apology to an African American community that has lived with the burning frustration of injustice that was the result of an intentionally indifferent criminal justice system. Many in the criminal justice system did not participate in lynching Black Americans, but they had firsthand knowledge of it and did nothing to stop it. The tone of indifference was demonstrated in 1940 by the Troup County Grand Jury, whose only recommendation after reviewing Austin Calloway's lynching was that the LaGrange City Jail should obtain better locks for cell doors. To the members of this church and the guests that join us this evening, your support and presence communicates an optimism that can influence our fellow citizens and institutions to work together to close a dark chapter in our history. Your presence here also demonstrates a character that was not present in our city September 8, 1940. Finally, this acknowledgement and apology is a further opportunity to build trust. But it must also be accompanied by a commitment to never again tolerate a climate of injustice. May God bless each of you and bless our efforts as we go forward together.
Just take that in for a minute. Just take in the courage and the determination to bring healing, and that this is what our discussion is about today. So to my panelists, let me just share with you a little bit of the format that I would like to use this morning. I did send out, Mike sent out the questions to you, so you are familiar with the questions. I've highlighted 5 of the 10 questions. We'll like to try to get it to 10 as many, but I do think that 5 of these are going to be, pretty critical. I want to begin by talking about the historical perspective of policing over the years. If many people in the audience might be familiar that, policing began back in the 1800s, around 1830, I think, during that time period. And policing actually was established for the purpose of slave management. And then it evolved from slave management into what it is today. So, there are various different groups who have different points of view on this. Some people feel that because policing started initially as slave management, that orientation has come through from a historical standpoint of view, and it's part of what we are managing today. So the question that we had put in is, to understand the perceptions of policing by members in our community, how important is it to consider the historical development of policing over time? My recommendation is that we want to spend about 10 minutes on each question. So I'd like all of the panelists to answer in no order. So we're going to be bonding today, right? We're going to be family. We're going to get our points across very quickly in 1 or 2 minutes. But I would like to start with Chief Diekmar because of the incredible moment that he's just provided for us by showing the video. Give us your thinking on the importance of looking at bringing healing by going back and looking at the historical context of policing in America.
Sure, and good morning, and thank you for inviting me, and appreciate the opportunity to share this morning with the rest of the panelists. I think it's critical, and I absolutely am certain that it's something that for most of police agencies and police officers, they don't know how much that history impacts the perception, particularly in minority communities, of the police. A year after Ferguson, I saw a Gallup poll that said public confidence in police at 20-year low. So I go back and I look up the Gallup poll, and we had slipped, I think, from 62% public confidence to 51. But I looked at the other 16 institutions. We were at 51. President Obama was at 44. Supreme Court was at 36. Media 19, and Congress at 9%. So our worst year in 20 years, we still had the 4th highest rating of public institutions. Now, you'd be satisfied with that if you didn't look further. And if you dig down into the poll results to the African American community, and this has been consistent because I've looked at them each year now when they come out, cut it in half. Instead of 51%, it's 25, 26%. And the reason is because of the history. And the most recent history, of course, would be the civil rights era, where intentional services were withheld, or there was coordination with white supremacists in order to assault and mob the civil rights participants. And because our folks don't know that history, they go into these communities, these young officers that you hire today, with a good heart to serve, and they're met with frustration, they're met with anger, they're met with aggression. And because they don't understand the history, they react to that emotionally, oftentimes behaving in a way that reinforces what those folks already think about the police. And so arming them with history helps them understand where that anger is coming from, and gives them perhaps the orientation to use that exchange as an opportunity to begin to redefine the police in those communities.
I want to thank everybody for having me here today. This is quite an honor. This is quite a panel. That was well said, Chief. That was well said. I think it's important that we study the history because, you know, this summer, I'm sure all chiefs, we had lots and lots of sit downs with people from the African American community, and we listened to their stories, and their stories are not that old. I mean, people were telling me stories of things they remember, and these people were my age and maybe a little bit older, and they were real and they were heartbreaking. And you know, it's a real history. Like no one in my family can tell me stories like I heard in those panels, and I think it is absolutely important for these officers that are out there in the streets to gain that empathy, to understand the perspective, to understand, you know, when the say the anger or the frustration is showing, to understand where that's coming from and slow down and make it a make it a win, because the only way we overcome our history is one contact at a time. And we do hire good people, and but I think that's one area that we're good at teaching them the skills, the technical skills of the job, but we've done a not so good job when it comes to head and heart, and I think that's where we need to start spending a lot more time, is in their hearts and their heads, and in the arena of empathy. So
Thank you.
Yeah, I believe that history is so layered too. I think history kind of gives context, not necessarily context that should be relived, as was already said, but it gives a context. Interestingly enough, I'm not sure how much of the general public is privy to that historical context. Maybe people who are more educated, I think certainly those who work in the department need to are aware of it and should keep that in mind and should consider it. But the general public, I'm not sure how much of the general public is familiar with that context. So what we have now is we have some who are armed with this information and a general public that may not be armed with this information. I think the weight of responsibility would fall more on those who are armed with this information to carefully and even meticulously approach it, considering this historical context, recognizing that it is the past, but also recognizing that the things in the present may even be tainted and even directed and influenced heavily by that context.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll make a couple of points, but first of all, thank you to all the panelists for being here, and Arlena for moderating this in your opening comments, which were wonderful. But when we teach Blue Courage, one of the points that we make to our officers is it's how important it is for us to know our history, because we need to know how we evolved, how we became who we are, how we've developed the methodologies, the belief systems that we have. But I also remind them that they are making history as well in their interactions, that every interaction that they have, literally they are making history. They're either reinforcing perhaps negative perceptions, or they're blowing those perceptions up. So we talk often about the fact that every interaction that a police officer has, whether it's big or it's small, is immortal, that it lives on in the hearts and minds and the histories and the stories and fabric of people's lives. And so knowing that and being cognizant of that, we hopefully are much more careful how we're contributing to that history. I recently heard a historian speaking, and of course, this historian's business is history, but what he said is, there's no such thing as history, there's only the stories of men and women. So I remind our police officers that we are making history, we're writing history of our agencies, our profession, and literally our own legacies in how we choose to interact or choose how we show up in any given moment. I also think understanding our history and our story helps us to be a lot more empathetic. Mr. Rogers, for 50 years, carried a passage in his wallet, and it said, "There's nobody you couldn't learn to love if you took the time to hear their story." And I think that's so true of us, that our empathy builds and our understanding builds when we take the time to understand people that we too often think of as the other.
Very powerful point. Thank you so much for that. Assistant Commissioner Hodges?
It's an honor to be here. I really enjoy doing these because personally, to be in an environment where you obviously have people who have that focus on really what's important is really uplifting and really helps me go in this profession. So for me, what I believe here is in Minnesota, to become a cop, you got to have a 2-year college degree, right? And now we've also had, by state law, each police officer has to get the historical context of institutional racism. Everybody has to take that every 3 years. That was passed a year ago in state law. So when I teach this, what I find is that a lot of the police officers, and I preface that having that 2-year degree point because I really want people to understand this part, is I'm getting people who already have a college education in my classes. And so when I teach this, what I find is a lot of the cops, quite frankly, just they've never been taught that history, right? And Peel said, you know, the public are the police and the police are the public. So these people are police officers, but they're also members of the public, and they're coming into these classes with 2 years of college education and absolutely no acknowledgement or don't even understand history. And I tell you, the one thing that really is poignant for them is when you talk about redlining. And when I talk about redlining, I pull up the map, the map of the old redlining maps, and I always overlay it with the current crime maps in these cities. And what you'll see is you'll almost see a direct result of the current redlining maps that are in alignment with the current crime piece in it. And a lot of the officers, when I teach this, you start to see that that's when the bell goes off in the head. And people, you know, I've had people cry in my classes just because they haven't not had that history. But I also teach in the context in which I think we need to do in society is acknowledge the past. I mean, there's nothing we can do to change it. We don't have a time machine, right? But what are we going to do moving forward in the future, right? And I think the biggest aspect of history that we need to understand in terms of how policing works is, and a lot of people don't understand this, is one of the questions I always ask is, which government branch does law enforcement lie in? You'll be surprised how many people in law enforcement don't know that we lie in the executive branch of government, right? Meaning we enforce laws, right? So even when we're out in the neighborhoods having these discussions with folks, you know, we let them know, like, law enforcement, we enforce laws, we don't write laws, right? So I mean, that's a historical context that I think a lot of people have to understand, but the general public does not know and understand history. So when people hear these historical things and they have no context in which they come from, that's where a lot of the anger and frustration comes in on both sides, where you have a lot of white officers who say, well, I never done X, Y, and Z. And you have a lot of people of color in these neighborhoods who say, well, you guys always do X, Y, and Z, and there's no understanding or lack of history. And I think we quite frankly need to get that better instituted in our schools.
Yeah, just really very powerful point. So, Assistant Commissioner Hodges, I'd like to stay with you then as we kind of go into the second question, because the second question is actually on structural, discrimination. And I think that, that there is camps on two sides, some that feel that there is no structural discrimination in America, so you talked about redlining, we think about the recent book that kind of came out on law, showing all of it. But as it relates to institutional discrimination, do you believe that institutional racism exists in this country? And also, can you give your point of view as to why you've stated your answer, and I will take an answer from each of you on this topic.
Yes, I think institutional racism exists in some areas. I think we've gotten better. The reason for my answer is this, and I know sometimes people, I don't want to sound like anybody else, but when you really, I'm a data person and I really look at where are we having these instances, right? So you look at a city, we'll sometimes say that we have institutional racism exists in the city, and then you'll look up and down the leadership of the city, and that leadership happens to be the same race of the person that's making that complaint, right? So how do we get to that point to where, is it the system or is it the people that actually run the system that we want to make that determination with? What I mean by that is this: if you have a system that is largely, you look at some of our areas in our cities where we're having this discussion. I'll just go for where I grew up, in the city of Minneapolis, right? The city of Minneapolis has had this institutional racism discussion for a long time, but the people who run the city are actually people of color. So I struggle with the racism term as opposed to bias, right? It's kind of where I go with this is, you get these people who are well-intentioned when they get into these positions, but they continue to reinforce the systematic aspects of systems that discriminate against people. So I'll give you one example. to apply for a lot of government jobs, you need to have a college degree, right? And I ask the question every time I go somewhere is, why are we making this a requirement? Well, because everybody that works here has it. Well, who's to say we're the best people to work here, right? I mean, there's no systematic discussion about why we're having these requirements to apply for jobs. So I do think it exists, but I think we need to really look at specific systems and where these problems are coming out. Because I think when we use the term racism, we've kind of desensitized people to it. People don't sometimes listen to it. Whereas for me, I prefer bias, because I think bias is something that as human beings, we all naturally possess. And if we say bias is something that every person has to acknowledge, versus if we say racism, where people mind automatically goes to the defensive, because people say, well, I ain't a racist, so I ain't got to listen to any of this, right? So versus bias, where everybody knows as human beings, we do have biases. It's just the way our brains are met. So
Thank you.
thanks.
I would agree with the commissioner as it relates to bias, but I would also say that I think there's a disproportionate impact more on class, and because African Americans are disproportionately represented in the poverty class, they are disproportionately impacted. And I'll give you a quick example. I arrest somebody on a Friday night for open container, take them to jail. If they're middle class, they're going to bond out as soon as they're booked. If they're living hand to mouth, they're not going to bond out. They're going to sit in jail 2 days, and then they're going to get OR'd by the court. The problem is that person had a job on Saturday, and that open container violation has now just introduced chaos into their life because they've lost that job. And so I think as institutions, we have to be intentional and deliberate about looking at our organizational practices, thinking that, well, we treat everybody the same, not realizing we don't have the same outcomes. And so one of the things that we did is we went through our city ordinances and our misdemeanor cases, identified, I think, 3 dozen that we know the court's going to OR, took them to the judges and said, hey, absent exigent circumstances, we'd like to just cite and release or book and release as opposed to incarcerating. And they agreed. And as a result, 2 things happened. One, when you explain this to people, I'm going to take you into custody, but we're going to process you and OR you. They now become your partner to get it done. And 2, we see a decrease in resisting arrest because this person isn't just dealing with the outcome of an open container, they're dealing with what they know is going to be a loss of a job, which is why they're going to resist, why they're going to attempt to get away from the officer. So I think class plays a bigger role, is a more important role than maybe we give credit to.
Yeah, if I can agree with both the chief and commissioner, I think it really is about bias, and even more so class. You know, I have long believed, you know, watching police officers as a young cop on the street, and as a minority too, by the way, I grew up with the belief that police officers tend to be disrespectful or abusive of people that they think cannot hurt them. And by hurting them, I mean have a voice. And we often forget that policing is a white male dominated profession. It has been historically, it still is today, even though it's changing, but not that significantly. But yet we police in our community those people who are most unlike us. You know, we police the most. Our minority communities are disenfranchised, those people who are mentally challenged. And so we spend the greatest amount of our time policing people who are so different from ourselves. And we spend very, very little time attempting to understand them and even to understand our own biases, our own conditions. And then we get thrust into this world that we're very, very unfamiliar with. And the culture takes hold, and the culture is very powerful. And the culture of policing teaches us how we're supposed to treat people who are different from ourselves. The first day out of the police academy as a young officer, my very first day when I was the most impressionable I suspect, in my career. The senior veteran officer, we didn't have FTOs back in those days, but the first thing he did when we left the station is he drove me into the Black community. And you knew when you crossed the street, you were now entering the Black community. And the first thing he said to me is, we don't come into this community neighborhood unless we're called. And when we come here, somebody always goes to jail and preferably goes to the hospital on the way. And this was one of the most respected police officers on the department, one who, when he spoke, people listened. He was very much revered and admired. That was the culture of the day in 1973 when I started in policing. And so Chief Deckmar is right. It is both about bias and it's about class. But we don't spend enough time teaching our police officers about those who are different from ourselves.
I also agree with what was said. However, I want to add that there are certain contingencies that we perhaps need to consider. Like location. What part of the country are we talking about? Our country is very vast. What cities are we talking about? Are we talking about suburbia? Are we talking about small towns? Are we talking about major metropolitan areas? And it very well is, I believe, is a scope. I do believe that bias is there, but I believe that bias is an offshoot from racism. I believe that we cannot ignore the ugliness of the big picture. We can't just bring the puzzle pieces that are manageable, that are pleasant. We can't just take in what's palatable. There is an ugliness underneath of it all that is based upon the foundation of this country. I do believe institutional racism does exist. If the policing system was founded on the purpose of policing slaves, that root cannot produce fruit any different from its root. So everything that springs from that, no matter how much we're trying desperately to bring about change, is going to have some indicator of its root. So I do believe that racism is one part of the spectrum. I believe bias and prejudice is on the other part. I believe class is on another part, but I believe it's all connected to the root. I believe everybody brings every part of who they are to everything, even though we don't show it all. We bring every part of who we are to whatever we come to. And I believe, as was mentioned, that if the only time a Black community sees a white face is when it's time for someone to be arrested, when it's time for someone to be accosted, when it's time for a crime to be dealt with, then there is a psychological representation that takes place where that face becomes iconic, even to the point where if it's not a person who is working with the department, a plainclothes person, it can be assumed that it's an undercover police officer. That bias is on both sides of the fence, but I believe in order to start changing and going in the other direction, there has to be representation and ideology has to change, and it cannot be that the only time there is the appearance is if crime is dealt with. Otherwise, that's what it begins to represent. And of course, bias, prejudice, racism, I believe all of them come from the same root.
Man, I'm probably going to echo a lot of what's been said here, but I agree with Mr. Hamilton. Being a police chief, one of our jobs is to discuss the undiscussable. And I know this past summer, we all had some really, really soul-searching conversations with our officers, because we had a lot of young officers that just didn't understand what was going on. And, those of us who came into the business when Rodney King happened, and we were sharing that stuff with them. And, you know, and I asked several officers, I said, do you think we have racism in our profession? And almost every single one of them said, absolutely not. In fact, they were offended by the word. And so then I flipped the term and I said, well, do you think we have bias? And they all said, absolutely, we have bias. We agree with you on that. And I said, well, you know, and I gave them an example. I said, this is a real thing that happened. I said, you know, we had an officer driving through a neighborhood, middle of the day. We're a pretty affluent town. A car passes him. It has a black couple driving the car. He turns around. They see him turn around as soon as they pass him. And he follows them for several blocks. And then he pulls them over for, you know, failed to signal within 100 feet or, you know, some pretext reason. And that guy called us. And he said, you know, he said, your officer was nice. He was professional. He didn't mistreat me. He didn't talk down to me. He goes, that I appreciate. He goes, but I question why he pulled me over. Why did he turn around? And, you know, I think we get away with saying, well, he just had a bias. Maybe it's unconscious, maybe it's implicit, but to the person receiving it, it's racism. That's how they feel. And I think that, you know, those are teaching moments for us, for these young officers, because, you know, the simple question is, why did you turn around? I mean, what made you turn your car around? There's not a really good answer there. And so, you know, I think we, you know, we sometimes misuse the word bias, and we try to make it lighter and less impactful than it really is. At least, you know, from the street levels, and you know, and it goes back to this historic. I mean, it all ties together. You know, it's all about education. It's about empathy. It's about bringing everybody, you know, to the table. And, you know, again, if the police did not do a lot of soul searching this summer, man, we missed an opportunity. And we are going to have to take a critical look at the way we do everything. Even like the other Chief Deckmar was saying, you know, looking at your ordinances, looking at the tax, you know, do we need to do pretext stops at the levels that we do them? You know, do we need to stop the just throwing a net out there and just stopping every car we can and trying to search them? You know, those things are old and they're wore out, and you know, and I think it just leads to feeding into the negatives of what we do. So I think there is systemic, but I think we can overcome it. It's just going to take a lot of work, and you've got to figure out a way to get us to challenge our beliefs and really look at what is it that makes you so uncomfortable about this discussion. But we got to have these discussions.
So then, Chief Borton, you've actually brought us to what I think is a segue to the next question. And it really does stand around, you know, adopting training models and a culture that supports the development of critical thinking. So what do you think stands in the way of adopting a training model and a culture that supports the development of critical thinking for leaders in managing human behavior, you know, within policing?
Well, I think there's, you know, those are barriers. You know, again, it's belief systems, it's old thinking. You've got officers that are all different tenure in your department. Trying to break a belief or challenge a belief I think is one of the most difficult things for humans to do, and because it rattles your identity, it rattles, you know, who you are, and I think, again, going back to what you said earlier, I think there needs to be a lot of emphasis put on emotional intelligence training. I think, and I've experienced it in my own department, when you get to really know who you are and how you impact and how you perceive the world, I think that's when you can start challenging a lot of things about your beliefs and the way you do things. You know, because there's, you know, we all know there are times when people should go to jail, and there are times, too many times, when people went to jail because they could, and those things have to stop, and those won't stop unless we really work on the critical thinking. You know, policing, you know, maybe, I hope I'm not that old, but maybe back in the day, it was a really physical, you know, a full contact sport. I think today's policing, it's all thinking. It's slowing down. You got to have emotional intelligence. You got to have emotional maturity, and you know, it's gonna take a lot of work. But I think, and like I said, going back to my own department and how when we brought in emotional intelligence training, they really didn't want it when it showed up. They were like, oh, you know. But when they went through it and they started seeing who they were, it really opened their eyes, and they really accepted it. And it changed the way a lot of them started doing their jobs. And so it works if you get the right, you know, the right people, the right trainers, and you got to have a strong culture that's open to being coached. You know, everything we've talked about today, it comes back to our cultures and holding people accountable to our culture, and you know, having the courage to do that.
Thank you. Very profound statements.
Yeah, I'll weigh in on what needs to change. I think our past is a huge driver of how we train and educate our police officers, and we're kind of stuck in the past. I think the chief said we just got to throw that stuff out and almost start over. One, we need to have a focus not just on training but on education as well. When we created Blue Courage, we did a little bit of research across the country, and what we learned was that 95 to 99% of all law enforcement training, from police academy to retirement, has a skills and tools focus, meaning we want to produce a highly skilled police officer who has the capacity to use the tools of our craft at a fairly high competency level. Yet we also took a look at what gets cops in trouble, what costs, you know, the headlines in newspapers, consent decrees, cops to go to prison, cops to be fired. And what we discovered was what every internal affairs officer knows, that what gets cops in trouble is rarely a failure of skills and tools. It's often that an officer knew exactly how to do what they were supposed to do and what they were supposed to do, but they chose to do something different. We call that hearts and minds, or if you want to really use a simplistic term, attitude. So if you look at law enforcement training education, we spend very, very little time on the thing that really hurts our profession, which is the hearts and minds. The thing that really is the driver of our behaviors. What are we carrying in our hearts? You know, how does that inform, you know, our intellectual decisions? And so, you know, Blue Courage, we take a much, much deeper approach to shaping the human being, shaping the guardian's hearts and minds, because we believe that's going to be the determinant of how a police officer behaves at those moments of truth and choice. And we also have another big challenge in our profession, and that is that we often, in our police academies in particular, we use those officers who have demonstrated skills over the years, a level of mastery, we use them as our teachers. And often they're not the best examples of what our police officers need to be. So that's number one. We need to be impeccably careful of who we are allowing to teach our police officers and who we're allowing them to be influenced by. You know, we always say that the most powerful influencers on police officers are how they're led, number one. Leadership is really important. Two, the culture, as Chief Barton said. But three, it's how we educate. What is the educational process? Not just going to training, but how are we educating them to be better, smarter, more discerning human beings that are whose behaviors are reflective of who they are and what they carry in their hearts.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is so often people look at police training and it's siloed. Training is one component. First, you have to have policy. That training has to be in harmony with policy. There's got to be active supervision to ensure that performance is consistent with the training and the policy. There's got to be corrective action, remuneration, retraining when there's a violation of that policy, some sort of discipline or accountability. There's got to be trend analysis. Look at your business practices and are the outcomes consistent with the expectations of the community? And then finally, are you doing stuff the same way you were doing 20, 30 years ago? I probably make 40 to 60 policy changes a year. Policies ought to always be changing. It's not the Torah. It's not something that you know it should be very dynamic. And so how you affect behavior through training is when it plays out in what they're doing on the street. And you know, one of the ways we recruit, you know, you got brochures and videos, and it's showing tactical units rappelling off of buildings, range shots, driving fast, blue lights flashing, sirens blaring. And I'm the last guy that an applicant sees. And I tell them straight up, I said, you know, if you're looking for cops and robbers, this is not the place for you. Because 90% of what we do is social work. And so if you are not committed to the notion of service, then this is not the place for you. And I've had folks that have come here and left because they say we're too involved in community policing. When you get people thinking of service, when you introduce programs and those programs affect the way they do their job, they're going to embrace it if they understand what the long-term goal is. And let me give you a couple of quick examples. Traffic stops for taillights, traffic stops for headlights, traffic stops for license plate lights. We got with all of our parts stores in the city and said, if we come up with a coupon of a discount of 10%, would you all honor it? They said, absolutely. So we stop somebody, we don't give them a ticket, we give them a discount for a part. Now we write a ticket and it goes in the system, but they don't get it. So a month later, if they haven't fixed it, they then get the ticket. But it just changes the entire involvement between the police and that driver that stopped, because the whole tone is different. It's one of, hey, you've got a problem, buddy, let me help you out. We've gotten more Facebook postings for those kind of encounters, particularly from African Americans. Another one, handle with care. We are in such a unique position to be an ombudsman for so many of society's challenges. We worked with the juvenile court and our superintendent for the schools and said, hey, we've got kids that are 7, 8, 9, 15 years old that witness a shooting, witness domestic violence, some sort of trauma. So they may not get any sleep that night. They're in the back of the class with their head down on their arms. The teacher sees this as a discipline issue because they don't know what that child's been through. So any officer, when they handle an incident where there's a child involved, they just send an email to the superintendent's office, 2 a.m. First thing the superintendent's office does is notify the teacher, handle with care the student. And it changes the whole dynamic. The failure, I think, for us to embrace the social work component, which makes up 90%, being the ombudsman for our community, I think is lost if not only training, but all those components of compliance are not a part of training.
It's funny, the conversation that Eagles have come out as policies and procedures for pigeons. And I think this Eagle conversation is important because this is how we can better, this helps us present something better to the general public. You know, there's a scripture that says, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. I've noticed that law doesn't change hearts. It never has. Laws and policies, it serves as a regulator, it serves as a standard. And it's just interesting to me that even even Jesus Christ himself took 3 years to train his hand-selected staff. And one of the biggest issues he had with those 12 men was racism, bias, and prejudice. It was the reason why. I mean, on one instance, they wanted to call down fire from heaven on Samaritans. I mean, so if this even happened with the very Son of God, I'm not sure if we will see the cessation of it here, but I do believe that just as it existed then, I believe many of us are called to model. I think we have to model what we want to see. I like what I just heard that mercy was shown and grace is shown, because knowing that the assumption is if I get stopped by law enforcement, it's over. And this poison over the last year has been pumped throughout the African American community because of recent events. So now there's not only the history that has to be considered, but now this ideology that's been triggered by current events, which of course calls for more sensitivity with policy and procedure and all of that kind of thing. But I'm not sure if it will ever go away systemically, because it's even like that in churches, the most segregated time of the week, and that's religious. So I think the key is having models, and I think that's why even Jesus chose 12 men, so that they can serve as models of it to bring about change individually.
Can I comment just real quickly?
Sure, absolutely.
To his point about the law, one of the things that we do a very poor job of training our officers is they like black and white, the law, and they take refuge behind the law. And what we don't teach them is the law. The legislature creates these laws as tools to solve problems. They're not intended to be clubs to beat people up with. And too often we hide behind the law when it's used in a way that was not intended. And what you see now is a push to take those tools away from the police because they don't have an appreciation for what the intent was.
So I can tell you, like, kind of how we've framed this here. One of the things that we did in Minnesota starting back in 2006 was we started a character-based hiring model where we went to the community and asked, what type of character traits do you want to see in your officers, right? We've now developed that to the point to where we just created another one where we went to the communities and asked them what type of character traits they want to see in officers. And the big ones obviously were respect and empathy and servitude and leadership. So when you look at that in terms of how do we hire people, right? Everybody that gets hired has to exemplify those values, right? And it's values that came upon in agreement with the community. Because the belief is that you can hire for character, values, and train for competence. Whereas in law enforcement, previously our model, the old model was we're going to hire for competence, right? And that is really shown a lot of results in the departments that have implemented that. And one of the last step in this, and this will be for me when I go to my next municipal department, because now I'm at the state and I run all the state police, and state policing is a different animal because you're dealing with the whole state. But from the municipal standpoint, where now you can take these values and say, okay, these are the values that we've come together with as a community. Now, these are not only law enforcement values, but these are values that the community has. So as law enforcement officers, we're going to be respectful, but the community has to be respectful, right? In terms of the community conduct. So, I mean, it's these values that we really want to get out there. And I mean, character is something that what we decide is we try to reinforce that into the workforce, and that's reverberated throughout all of training. And I'll just give you an example. If one of our things is the community said we want cops to be empathetic, right? And that's one of our values, is to be empathetic. That whole piece of who can go to jail and who should go to jail. that's where that character trait or that value is going to come into play for everybody. And obviously law enforcement organizations, people hold these jobs for 20 to 25 years. And I jokingly say, my boss, the commissioner, started law enforcement the year I was born. Right? So, I mean, it's one of these things where, you know, people stay in this profession for a while. So it takes some changes. It takes a while to make these changes. But I personally, that in terms of law enforcement training, I believe it starts right up front when you hire people and hiring people for values. And these are not the values that enforcement agency comes up with. Yeah, we have some input. We make sure our values align with the community, but these are values that the community has and they bring to us. And it's kind of funny with any organization when we do training, people always laugh. I shouldn't say laugh, but when people start to mock some of the training, oh, well, how is this training showing empathy, right? And I'll go into my leadership piece here. As a leader, everybody has an image of us or an imitation of us, right? And if you want to, you know, if you don't think that your people who work for you have an imitation of you, you're in a different place. If you ever want to know an imitation of yourself, go ask one of your kids to imitate you, and I guarantee you they'll give you a good imitation, right? But the people who work for you have that same imitation, right? So I mean, it's an opportunity for us to really emphasize those values and get them out there. And it's, you know, the good thing about having an imitation, people have an imitation of you, you can control what that imitation is. And if you keep saying empathy, respect, servant leadership, and that's the values of the department and that's the value of the community, I think the training just comes secondhand in that.
Thank you. So, well, let's think about this then, because to do all of what we're discussing today, it's going to take a fair amount of trust. I think, you know, Covey's last piece of work, I think it may have come from his son, around trust. And trust seems to be something that is almost fundamentally broken in many of our communities. So how do we build a foundation of trust necessary to form the partnership between the police and the communities? And I think what I'd like to do is start with Minister Hamilton, because I'd like to get his perspective before we go into those who are actually in the business of policing. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Very interesting. I've been a chaplain for 3.5 years. And even coming as a chaplain, there was the guys that trained me basically said, initially, it's the ministry of presence. It's the ministry of just being there. What I observed is there's a lot of innate distrust there. And because as a police officer, you're part of the community, but you're not quite part of the community. You're loved and you're hated. You're despised, you're lauded, and then you are lacerated. You hugged, you kissed, and you kicked. I mean, it's kind of similar to ministry, and so there's a hesitancy to just open up. But I believe that if you want to change reputation, you change repetition and consistency, presence, being repetitious in that, but yet being true to the calling of policing or whatever calling it is. Communication is definitely important, how things are communicated. Presence, and not presence in the event of enforcing the law, but just simple presence. I grew up in New York, and in New York, it's just a different culture, even with policing, because I remember the cops that walked the beat in the neighborhood I lived in. I grew up in Crown Heights, on the border of Crown Heights and Bedford-Stuyvesant, and we knew those police officers. We knew them personally. As a matter of fact, we knew them so much that they were able, by their very influence, to stop some things and prevent some things. And when things happen, so it was, and they weren't all African American. Mm-hmm. So there's something that could be said for persistent presence being repetitious and communication that kind of builds this trust so that it combats the idea of the institution of law enforcement being demonized, and it humanizes the institution.
Thank you.
Well, if to me, the one word working definition of community policing is partnerships. And the only way you can have effective partnerships is to have trust. And if you look at the history and the challenges that we have, particularly in minority communities, and you want to build trust, then to quote a preacher that I work with on occasion, he says, if you're going to be a bridge, then don't be surprised if you're walked on. And so you're going to have to take some slings and arrows. You're going to have to take some criticisms that aren't necessarily fair to you as an individual, but look at it and realize that probably there's some merit as it affects your profession. And the whole thing about trust is it doesn't buy you a pass. It buys you time to get information and facts and demonstrate to the community when they're concerned about a police action as to whether or not that police action was legitimate. That's what it does. It buys you time to get the facts. Those jurisdictions that have, we've seen gone literally up in flames, clearly didn't have the trust to get the facts, because oftentimes the facts acquitted the officer. But it was just one more, it was, the proverbial straw on the camel's back, not so much that isolated incident, but the history of those kind of incidents. I guess the other thing I would say with regard to trust is you begin to see it pay off over time. The NAACP president and I used to knock heads constantly. And then we worked together on this trust initiative and the apology and the acknowledgement. And what you find when you work with people on those things you can agree with, you find out that you're not as far apart as you thought on those other issues. And one of the the police are just one of the many issues that plague minority communities. Education's another. And as we got to working closely together, he said, do you think you could arrange a meeting with the president of the school board and the superintendent? And I said, yeah, I think I could. So we arranged a meeting. The NAACP and some other interested community members wanted a task force for the education system. And after some back and forth, they finally agreed. And the school board superintendent said, all right, well, we'll have the next meeting then. How about 2 weeks? Does that work for you? We can meet here. And the NAACP president said, no, I want to meet at the police department. I want to meet on neutral ground. And so to come full circle where communities start seeing us as a resource, I think is key to communicating whether or not you're starting to develop the necessary component of trust to be effective.
Thank you.
I think, when you look at this, the way that I always frame it for people is we do this exercise about, let's list the organization, the corporation that you don't trust, right? And I'll just pick one for those of you who have cable or internet, Comcast, right? Or CenturyLink, whatever it may be, right? You ask people, why don't you trust them, right? And it normally comes down to they have a monopoly. They treat most people like crap. The complaint process isn't transparent, and they have a monopoly on their prices, right? And when you look at that, I say, okay, well, what other government organization fits this bill? Law enforcement. Right. I mean, we have a monopoly. Who's going to really go out and contract for policing? Right. So how do you fix that? And I think what the pastor said is spot on. Repetition. Like, I'll just give my own personal example. I've had Comcast forever. And earlier in my time with them, I'd say I didn't trust them. Now I do trust them. Right. I mean, earlier on, bills were messed up, people hang up on you, and then you'd have to sit online for half hour trying to get somebody back on the phone, right? But now, for the last, 10 years, I call, they answer the phone, they answer all my questions, they explain the prices to me. That repetition is much to where I can say on a public forum that I trust Comcast based on my experience with them. I think as law enforcement, again, like what the pastor said, that repetition for us is key. Because right now, if someone asks me what I think of Comcast, I'm going to say, you know, before, terrible. Now, square business. And I think once we get to that point with law enforcement, we've really got somewhere. And I think that's the model that agencies need to take, is how do you view these organizations that you trust and what you don't trust, and how we fit in that, and what would it take for you to trust that organization?
Yeah, for me, it's relatively simple. You know, Dr. Stephen Covey used to always talk about that we behave our way into mistrust, or we behave our way into trust. And he used to famously say that, you know, what you do speaks so loudly to me that I can't hear what you're saying. And so, you know, I believe in policing, we need to make sure that our behavior matches our rhetoric. From the top of the chief's office to the officers on the street who are enacting, you know, policy and enforcement. And I think what Chief Deckmar did with saying he was sorry and offering an apology is something that we rarely see or rarely do in policing, that could just go an immense way to building bridges. You know, when we're wrong, you know, say we're wrong. Superintendent Hiller in Chicago used to say, you know, when we mess up, let's fess up and fix it up. And we shouldn't run from that. We shouldn't try to hide that the fact that we make mistakes and we're imperfect. We're human. I don't believe the community expects us to be perfect. They expect us to be human. And so I think, you know, being honest, speaking from our heart, you know, when we're sorry, let's say we're sorry, and do it from a heartfelt place. I think that goes a long way to building trust. And I would also add, in policing, we need to drop the defensiveness. We really do. We often act like we have a chip on our shoulder, and we act like the world hates us, which is not true, by the way. When I have the privilege of teaching police officers almost every day up until this virus occurred, but one of the most common refrains is they believe the community hates them. They believe the media is always against them, neither of which are true. I was teaching a class in Niagara Falls, and I will never forget a young police officer who made the statement. He said, I go out in a community every single day as a police officer, in a community where everybody's trying to kill me. And I was so astonished by the comment. I said, what did you say? And he said it again. He believed that. You know, I'm not sure where those beliefs come from, but, you know, Niagara Falls, the most dangerous thing is the falls. But we have a lot of police officers who are reinforcing myths about policing and about the community and about our work and how people feel about us. And it puts us in this victim place that is unattractive and is not worthy of trust. So I think apologizing, dropping the defensiveness, being more human is what, behaving our way into it is what's going to lead to trust.
Thank you.
We bring a lot of, I don't know what the word is. I'm gonna call it fear. Like just like what Michael said, you know, we have guys that, you know, they watch YouTube videos, or they go talk to somebody who, you know, this happened to me, and now that turns into every single person they're going to talk to. And then when their sergeant or a captain says something to them, you know, they throw up the officer safety card. They're like, well, if I do that, I'm going to get killed. If I do that, I'm going to get killed. You know, and I'm like, I'm not asking you to hesitate. I'm not asking you to quit thinking. I'm asking you to be a human being. And what is in front of you is what's in front of you. Of course you're on guard, but there are good skills that can be better utilized. And so one thing that kind of hit my mind while everybody was talking was, I don't know how many departments are still doing it. I feel like a lot of them, but the manner in which we measure the performance of police officers, you know, if they think that they gotta have certain stats at the end of the month, that just leads to poor police work. That just leads to guys going out. That's when people that don't need to go to jail end up in jail, and bad decisions are made, bad tickets are written. In terms of the trust, I think, you know, I met with some leaders of our Black community here in my town, and you know, the guy said kind of what Mr. Hamilton said, and he was absolutely true. He said, you know, Chief, he goes, you control the culture of your department. And he said, and it's your responsibility to do everything you just said you're doing. And he said, but I'm not going to believe you the first time, and I'm not going to believe it the second time. He goes, it may take 3 or 4 times of me experiencing it differently for me to understand that, yep, they have really, they're now walking their talk. And you know, and I've passed that on. I think that's important to understand. It is repetition. You know, it is, you know, I don't know if I've said it earlier or not, but I mean, people say what they think, but they behave what they believe. And so, you know, we have to bring everybody to the table in forums like this. You know, I know we're probably all doing it in our communities, but we can't do it enough because we need to hear everybody's voice. I think the police profession has spent too many decades trying to solve problems alone, and we're not listening. And, you know, that's what I took away. You know, we had protests in our city just like everybody did, you know, and I think that was the time for chiefs and police officers to just listen. Don't get defensive. Just try to understand. And you know, if the communities that distrust us the most see it and they feel it and they experience it, it will become real, and it will change. We can change a lot of things, but it's one stop at a time, and it's one, you know, it doesn't even have to be a police action. It's just simple interactions throughout the day, throughout your community. And like Chief Deckmar said, it's, you know, being a chief is hard work because you've got to build a lot of relationships. Well, guess what? So do your officers. They need to have the same relationships. And, you know, it's the heavy lifting that needs to get done. And I think the more we do it, the more belief we'll get. And I think because eventually we'll cross that threshold where the trust is more there, and the, you know, the momentum starts. But we can't do our jobs without our communities. We all know that. Every chief knows that. We need to have a community to keep it safe. That's kind of my slogan in my PD is communities keep communities safe. You know, and we're not the sole provider of that. We need them, and we've got to do whatever it takes to build that trust.
So, Chief Barton, that is so well said. We're down to the last couple of minutes here. You know, there's a couple of things I just want to do to kind of close out our conversation. First of all, when I retired last year and had a conversation with Mike Alexander about what I would do in the next chapter of my life, I wanted to be in service. The idea of coming into this work, into the policing community as a spiritual director and a leader, this conversation has solidified to me without a doubt that this is my calling. You gentlemen are definitely the bearers of nobility, which is what this conversation was about. It's clearing the pathways for bringing healing into our communities. There should have been 1 million people on this call today. We have recorded it. Every one of us needs to figure out how we are going to leverage this conversation to take this work going forward in the future. We talked about the fact that we have to bring the history into visibility, that we have to understand that this idea of talking about the word racism is charged. And as my teacher would tell me in the area of cultural competency, Dr. Deborah Egerton, it's really about people understanding that whether we like it or not, there is an automatic advantage in this country for other people, and we have to, you know, bring that forward. We talked about the fact that every geography is different, and that training and trust are key points of which we each have to collectively figure out how we are going to take this forward. I want to take the last minute to introduce Mike Alexander to many of you, and Mike Wilson. They are the sponsors and or bringing about this work. And I did mention the programs that they are, bringing forward now. And Mike Neal also talked about the work that's being done by Blue Courage. So the resources are out here. And if I can ask you, Mike, to kind of close out this session. First of all, I want to thank you for this privilege of being able to make this happen today. I want to thank Wendy Lynn for always being with me. We're a good team to kind of bring this work forward. And most importantly, I want to thank each of you who took the time when you saw this advertisement to come and be part of this sacred, sacred, sacred work. Mike, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. This has truly been a pleasure. Just sitting here, taking in the breath that each of you spoke into. I think it was Viktor Frankl who said many years ago, between the stimulus and the response, there's a space. And in that space is where the power resides. And you have stepped into that space this morning, and you have really spoke to the essence of clearing the pathway for healing and policing in this United States. And I thank each of you for your willingness to be a part of this esteemed panel. A mentor, friend of mine many years ago taught me a definition of leadership that I carry with me everywhere I go. And it is this: it's the process of influencing human behavior to achieve organizational goals that serve the public. Now, while I'm doing that, I am developing individuals, I'm developing teams, and I'm developing an organization for future service. That is truly a noble profession that we're a part of. And each of you have exemplified the image bearer of nobility today. And I thank you for doing so. Many years ago, and I use this quote often, many years ago, a president of these United States was John F. Kennedy in the 60s. And I think you all know what was going on in the 60s. We had a battle here in these United States around peace and war. We also had it abroad. And he spoke on June 10th, 1963 at American University. And he chose that day to speak about peace, not only from a global perspective, but he brought it down to stateside. But more importantly, he brought it to each community. But even more profound than that, he brought it to neighbor to neighbor. And here's just a small excerpt of what he said. He said, first of all, let us examine our attitudes towards peace itself. He said, too many of us think it is impossible, and too many of us think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief, and it leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable. And I want you to think about that for a moment, because what he's really saying to us is that if we do not believe that we can make a difference, then why in the world are we in the positions in which we are in? I think it was Charles Swindoll who said, the longer I live, the more I realize the impact of my attitude on life. He said, attitude will make or break a company, a church, a home, and we decide the attitude in which we will embrace for that day. You see, because attitude does what? It determines our altitude. I think it was Yogi Berra who said that 90% of the game is mental. So if we go into a situation thinking that we can't win, then absolutely we will not win. But the beauty of Kennedy's speech, he didn't stop there. He said, we need not accept that view because our problems are man-made and therefore they can be solved by man. And man can be as big as man want to be. No problem beyond human destiny is beyond human beings. And man's reasons and spirit have often solved problems that seemed on the surface to be unsolvable. We've done it once, twice, and I truly believe we can do it again. Every problem that we're dealing with and everything that you guys spoke about today is a man-made problem. And if man created the problem, man can solve the problem. But there are two reasons why we are not solving the problems that need to be solved. And I substitute two words, reasons and spirit, with these two words, egos and attitudes. The moment we decide to remove egos and attitudes from the equation, thus you will begin to see problems being solved in our profession. Can we solve them? Absolutely.
Amen.
So one of the things that Mike and I have done over the years, we've developed a platform. It's a software platform. And it's a workforce behavior intervention platform. And it really is one of a kind. It's a revolutionary product. And I know you perhaps have heard that before as far as intervention, early intervention, but this one picks up on what we call micro motives. Micro motives, almost your thoughts, move into our micro behavior, where our focus is on micro behavior, the little subtle things that we have a tendency to dismiss. And it is designed so that micro motives and micro behavior will mitigate macro behavior. So before it hit the traditional early warning systems that are out there today, this system picks up and force leaders to be leaders by engaging their employees. There's a great little book that's written by a guy by the name of William Pennick, and it's called The Way of the Shepherd. The Way of the Shepherd. It's a religious book, but it's a powerful book that speaks to the idea of a shepherd taking care of his sheep. It's in a parable form, but I want to thank each of you again for your willingness to be a part of this esteemed panel. I will be in touch, Chief Deckmore, you and I, as well as Mike. We have a mutual friend and a guy by the name of Larry Hesser. And when I began to talk about this, he immediately told me about you guys. And thank you so much, both of you, for your willingness to be a part of this. Hodges, Commissioner, I read a lot of your work. And Police One and a variety of other places is how and why I reached out to you. And Minister Hamilton, I know you because of our church affiliation, and I've visited your congregation on many occasions. And Chief Barton, because of our mutual friend and good friend of mine, Matt Christian, how you ended up here. So thank you guys so much for your willingness to be a part of this, and please stay in touch. You can find and follow us on our website, but we love you, we appreciate you, thank you very much.
And we thank all our audience for coming today. This will end our program. We apologize for going for a few minutes over, but the comments in the last few minutes were, definitely needed. So let's go out into our communities and continue to bring this work forward. It's been a blessing and a pleasure to be with you all. This will end our program for today. Thank you.
As you can see, the problem is deep, it is gigantic in extent, and chaotic in detail. Our immediate goal is to explore and highlight efforts that increase our understanding and create meaningful change. Our hope is to build on the cosmic discontent enlarging in the bosoms of people of goodwill all over this nation, so that our police of today will be a completely transformed and much better police department of tomorrow. Thank you.